And as you can see, I'm going to take a detour from the lecture series we've been doing together on the lifespan revolution and do something that is obviously on our minds. And now there's enough, I think, evidence and analysis to talk about it in a way that isn't simply expressing our outrage about what happened in Memphis last month, but a little bit more constructive in terms of trying to figure out why this happened and what we can do to stem the tide of police violence against African American men in this country, and to be as clear as possible, right? This happens every day, right? And so every now and then it happens in this graphically obvious way recorded on video. But police violence against African American men is endemic to American society. What can we do about it? And to understand that, we need to understand the roots of it. The roots are complex, and they are actually rooted in, among other things, stereotyping, right? And the reason I underline that is because in the ongoing lecture series on the lifespan revolution, I'm about to transition to talking about the stereotyping of the elderly or the aged, what is called ageism in our panoply of isms. And the thing I want to emphasize today is that actually thinking about ageism helps us to understand racism, and thinking about racism helps us to understand ageism. And because all of us, we hope, will live to be elderly. Unfortunately for Tyre Nichols, that is not the case, and that's part of the tragedy here. But all of us, in a sense, stereotype our future selves to the extent we engage in ageism. And this might just give us a toehold for a little bit more sympathetic, critical reflection on what it is like to be stereotyped. Because if we understand ageism well, we understand how destructive this is, not just for some other group, but for a group to whom we all hope to, many of us do currently already, eventually belong. Right. And so that's where I want to go today. I have a lot of territory to cover with you. Next slide, please. I want to start with a little bit of information about John, are you having trouble advancing the slide? I think on the bottom left, there's an arrow there. Yeah, there you go. And one of the things that I think is extremely important in that previous slide, and I'll show you a little bit more about this, is that of the 6 officers involved in this catastrophe, 5 of them, the 5 who have been charged with murder, are themselves African American. And so in a sense, I think this helps us to see a little bit better what is going on in our society with police culture, but also with self stereotyping. I'll get to this in a moment, but I think this is actually just analytically and dispassionately speaking for a moment, a very good illustrative case for us. So, first of all, Tyre Nichols, right? And so, as far as I can tell, an ordinary, actually quite well liked, somewhat adrift in terms of his life plan, relatively young man, 29 years old, from Memphis, moved to Sacramento, California to live with his father when his parents divorced. His father succumbed to a terminal disease very young. Tyre kind of cut loose and spent the better part of a decade trying to figure out what to do with his life in Sacramento. The expense of living there got to be too much. He moved back to Memphis, had been there just a couple years when this terrible incident happened on January 7th. Among other things to know about him is that Mr. Nichols was thinking of becoming a police officer, that we know from his social media posts that he did not like or trust the police or the government, but he also thought that perhaps the best way to change the institution was from within, and so he was considering becoming a police officer. We'll never know what he would have done in his life. And then on January 7th, he was pulled over by the police in Memphis, and for alleged reckless driving. And I don't know. I have not seen good evidence as to whether or not that, as well as everything else in the police report, is fabricated, or whether he was actually driving recklessly, or alternatively, whether he was just guilty of driving while black in the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time. Please note, by the way, this was 8:20 in the evening. It was not right in the middle of the night. Um, we are, I imagine, many of us familiar, having been pulled over by the police, how this is supposed to go. There's a protocol. A single officer is supposed to approach the car, supposed to ask for your license and registration and explain to you why you've been pulled over. As opposed to that, the word that's being used here is the police swarmed his vehicle. Three of them came at him simultaneously, demanded that he get out, pulled him out of the car, threw him to the ground, and then sprayed him with pepper spray, right? And the interesting thing to note here, I've discussed this with several young African American men, and they basically say the same thing. And the prelude to this is that when it became clear that they were going to beat and pepper spray him, Tyre Nichols escaped and attempted to run home. He was only about 600 yards from home. The young African men I speak to about this say, what are we supposed to do in this situation, right? On the one hand, if we just stay in the custody of the police, we don't know how long the beating is going to go on, or if it is going to be so brutal that it might turn lethal. And on the other hand, if we attempt to run away, we then know that there's a good likelihood that they're going to shoot us or use deadly force, right? And so that dilemmatic aspect of the situation, I think, is part of what the video footage in all its awful graphic detail helps us to understand. And I've never been in this situation, but I know enough about neuropsychology to know that the brain goes into a fight or flight mode when you are under attack with people wielding batons and kicking and spraying and punching you. And so I don't think we can really think that this was a rational calculation. So he attempts to escape home. He's reapprehended. He's subdued. And when I say subdued, right, they pin his hands behind his back. They put a handcuff on one of his wrists, and then they proceed to punch him repeatedly in the head and beat him with a baton and do the injuries that lead a few days later to Nichols' death. The New York Times has analyzed the footage. There's some good resources there. I imagine other places as well. And among the things they find is that he was given 71 contradictory commands in a very short period of time, shouted at him in ways that it was really impossible for him to comply. Among the most obvious examples, one officer is saying, show me your hands, while two other officers are holding his hands behind his back. And again, there's a protocol for how this is supposed to go. A single officer is supposed to be in charge of the encounter with the suspect, give clear commands, give them one at a time, and repeat them until they are complied with. So nothing about this went the way it was supposed to go. And then, of course, the police filed a report alleging that Tyre Nichols resisted arrest, reached for their guns and their pepper spray or mace. All of it was rapidly discredited. And here I think we have to note that some of the reforms that are in place, particularly the fact that the police are required to have body cameras on them and they left their body cams on, that there was video footage being recorded from their cars, from the neighboring lampposts in the street, means that we have a very detailed understanding of what occurred. And this is not what it would have been 3, 4, 5 years ago. Basically, if the police were uniform in maintaining, as they likely would have been, that Mr. Nichols resisted arrest, reached for their guns, there would have been no consequences for these officers. But in the world we live in today, with the video evidence, that in fact is not the case. They are obviously innocent until proven guilty. And so what I will say about them is not meant to indicate what the criminal verdict should be against them, but just what public judgment should be. And the evidence here, the visual evidence from the body cams, etc., is very clear that this was a brutal assault on a man who did nothing to resist until he had been beaten and sprayed, and then all he did was try to flee people who were trying to do violence to him. Another aspect of this that's worth commenting on for just a moment, this was a so-called specialized crime fighting unit. This was the Scorpion unit of the Memphis Police. And when I say these units wax and wane, they come into popularity in tough on crime moments when there is a perception, and I'm going to underline perception, we'll come back to this, that crime rates are rising, that violent crime is out of control. People want to get tough on crime. This has been a recurring motif in American politics for at least 60, 70 years. It has a lot to do with the mythology of the Wild West and the way in which that was created by Hollywood in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and then racial politics, that getting tough on crime is often a metaphor for social control over African Americans. And so in these periods when there is heightened public support for tough on crime measures, one of the typical responses is to create a special crime fighting unit to give them greater latitude, to tell them to be aggressive, often to equip them with more lethal equipment, and generally to take them out from under the supervisory structure of the regular police department. This then very quickly often is discredited because, first of all, it doesn't work. And we know this, that when police are understood by the community they're policing to be a hostile, occupying force, to be behaving very much in the way that gangs behave, then the community stops cooperating with the police. And it's really impossible for the police to root out crime in a neighborhood or community where the residents, the people who belong to that community, are not cooperating, are not sharing information, are not giving tips, won't call the police, because calling the police means that random violence is likely to be rained down upon your neighborhood. Better to just put up with the terror of the crime, right? So that's the first reason. It turns out the community-based policing, the kind of policing where the police actually work in and with the members of the neighborhood, get to know them and work with them to build trust and then solve problems, is much more effective. And then the second reason we tend to move away from this is because incidents like what happened in Memphis on January 7th happen all too often, and they eventually come to light, and then there's a scandal and reform occurs. And so one hope about the constructive lesson we can draw from Memphis on January 7th is that we have to get out of this pendulum cycle in which we go back and forth between using specialized crime fighting units and disbanding them. It's a failed technique. It has such a high association with violence and abuse. We should eliminate this and work to institute more effective reforms. The other thing that I want to emphasize, right, the racial composition of the officers, right, and 5 of the 6 officers on the scene are Black. Those are the 5 who are going to be charged with murder. And by the way, the chief of police in Memphis is also an African American woman, right? And so the idea that police violence on African Americans can be solved or addressed simply by diversifying the police, I think is a mistake. And it doesn't mean that we don't want to diversify the police, but it does mean that by itself, this will not solve this just won't solve the problem, right? And the issue here is police culture as a whole. And I mean that in 2 senses, right? The first is the way in which being a member of the police force in so many cities inculcates a almost tribal attitude of us versus them. We are the ones who protect ourselves. They are the ones who attack us, bring law and disorder to their communities, and put us in harm's way. And the result is a dehumanizing, a brutalizing, all too often of the communities. And I want to be as clear as possible. This is not uniform. We can't generalize. We don't have national police forces or policies like so much in the United States. This is handled by local government and very hard, therefore, to generate national policy on. But we can make some generalizations, right? And there are, I am quite confident, more good police officers doing more good work than there are bad police officers. But the idea that this is bad apples, I don't think works. This is police culture. And so part of it is the us versus them mentality, which lays hold of African American police officers very often as much as white or Latino or Asian police officers. And then there's the second issue, which is that we just use police to do so much more in the society than most other societies do. That includes traffic stops, right? That would not be armed officers who are also crime fighters in many other communities. We rely on them for people who are having mental breakdowns, for domestic violence cases, for potential suicide cases. And often they're the first on the scene when there's a traffic accident, et cetera, right? And so the idea that we overused armed, primarily men who are not trained to manage many of the situations they're asked to intervene in is a further systematic root of this. And then the second point I want to make here has to do with implicit bias and self stereotyping. And I'll get into this, but the basic claim here is that the association of Black men with criminality and violence is so thoroughgoing, so ubiquitous, so inescapable in our culture, especially in our media system, but also reproduced by us in everyday interpersonal interactions, that it seeps into the unconscious, implicit ways we organize the social world in the categories of our minds, that it affects and influences all of us. And this includes African Americans, and this is where self-stereotyping comes in. And we'll speak more about that because this is a concept that is also extremely relevant to ageism. And so then what I want to do for the remainder of the lecture is talk about some of the broader context here. Before I do that, John, could you advance? I'll just share with you a little bit of um, the background here. Oh, so something didn't transmit in my slides, but that's okay. I just had an image. It's okay, John. We'll stay here. Of the uh, let's go back one image. The police officer, the police chief in Memphis, whose name is escaping me at the moment, but another African American woman, and so again, just to emphasize, putting a black woman in charge of the police, putting black police officers on the street is not enough, right? And here then we have the horrendous graphic images captured that let us see exactly what happened. The first image on the left is of Mr. Nichols being dragged out of his car and pepper sprayed. The second image is after he fled and then is reapprehended. Again, in a sense, it's fortunate that we can't see all the detail here, but he has his hands uh, pinned behind his back, and one of the detectives is winding up to hit him in the head repeatedly. Let's go to the next slide now. And the next slide has another image, but this is the image, the awful, brutal image, the one that I've suggested in the past gives us a perfect map of the power structure of so much of American society. This is an image I think that is much more typical when we think of police violence against African American men. But I think actually the killing of Mr. Nichols may be more typical and so more illuminating. It's not a single individual almost pathologically snuffing the life out of another individual after he's been subdued. It's a gang of men simultaneously raining violence down on another man. And it is not necessarily white on black. It can just as easily be black on black. Next slide, please. Thank you. And this is just to get at how frequent and common this is, right? If we were to say their names, there would be thousands of names we would have to say. Next slide. Uh, so we need to go back just one, and very quickly, this is to point out how disproportionate this is. If you're black in the United States, you are 3 times more likely to be killed by the police than white people. This despite the fact that white people are more likely to be armed when encountering the police, that crime rates are very similar between blacks and whites. And so again, this does not reflect relative prevalence of criminality or threat. This reflects the disproportionate fear that police officers have of black men. Next slide, please. This is to show you that there's very limited accountability. I've shown you a diagram like this before. The last time I showed you this diagram might have been a year and a half ago, and the rate was over 99%. So things have improved ever so slightly, but the vast majority of police officers do not face any sort of criminal charge when they are involved in killing somebody they're trying to apprehend. And this vastly limits the accountability. You combine that with qualified immunity that typically also resolves them of any civil liability. And there is a real problem. And again, my claim is not per se that we should be prosecuting more police officers. They shouldn't be immune if they engage in criminally culpable violent behavior, but that we have to actually work to retrain the police force so this is not so prevalent. Next slide, please. And just to be aware, right? In the late spring and summer of 2020, this country had the largest and most sustained protests around police violence it's ever experienced under the banner of Black Lives Matter. And yet, it appears it has had really no influence on the frequency of police killing. You can see in the diagram on the left that basically this is very constant for the last decade, with the police killing 1,000 people a year or more every year, and actually the numbers increasing slightly in recent years. And then the diagram on the right shows you again the disproportion. It depends on the city, but there are cities like Chicago, Minneapolis, Boston, where if you're Black, you're 25 times or more likely to be killed by the police. We get down to cities like Pittsburgh and Atlanta, where you're 10% more likely. And then the vast majority of American cities, you're 5% more likely. There's exactly one where there's no disparity, and that's Mesa, Arizona. Next slide, please. Um, so, uh, yeah, back one, thank you. This is, I think, to speak to just a natural question. Well, maybe we're having increased police violence because we're having increased violent crime, and so the police need to use violence to try to subdue violent criminals. And the diagram on the far left shows you that this is far from the truth. If we look at most categories of violent crime, they have been actually going down consistently for the last 30 years, and that includes the period of the pandemic. If we look in particular at the murder rate, it has gone up, and gone up rather sharply since 2020, related to the pandemic, related to people being turned out of jobs, turned out of schools, thrown back into neighborhoods that are dangerous with very little to do, and where guns are easily accessible. Now, having said that, I think what matters here is the public opinion. And as you can see, public opinion in 2022 suggested, at least among registered voters, that crime was a very important issue for 60% of the population, 80% of African Americans, the third most important issue in the 2022 elections, behind abortion and inflation. Next slide, please. And this helps us to understand where I think the obvious misperception comes from, right? That the diagram on the left shows us, right, that most Americans believe there is more crime in the United States from every year beginning in 1998 to 2015, and that in almost every year from 1998 to 2015, the actual violent crime rate went down, right? And then the diagram on the right shows you a comparison between the reporting on crime and the actual amount of crime in one city. In Baltimore, it was easy to get the information for this. And as you can see, right, the number of crimes that are homicide, murder, or non-negligent manslaughter are a very small portion of the overall crime rate, but they are the disproportionate majority of the crimes that are reported on. Right. And so there's a real skew. There's one more piece of information that I think is relevant here, and this has to do with local broadcast news, television news. And so what we know is that violent crime has gone down over a 30-year period, and over that same period, local news has either kept the reporting on crime constant or actually increased it somewhat. And there's a simple reason for this. This is commercial media, and people turn on the news. If there's not a story about violent crime, they think it's a sleepy news day and they turn it back off. If there is a story about violent crime, they stay watching, they're horrified, they're frightened, they want to know what happened, and then they'll watch through the commercial break, sometimes watch the whole broadcast, right? And so crime going down, coverage going up, crime concentrated in nonviolent crime, the coverage concentrated on violent crime. This is part of what drives our overly militarized police response to crime. Then, of course, there is the politics of it. And we have had since Richard Nixon's campaign in 1968 for the presidency, at least, a thematic that runs deep through American politics of law and order. And the idea here, I think, of the pairing of those terms is very important, right? That in a sense, and we've talked about this before, many people find themselves to be challenged by the rate and pace of cultural change. Many people find themselves to be rendered recently socially precarious, right? And so they're having trouble making ends meet. They feel like the economy has become much meaner and more hostile. And so they desperately want to restore order. And I think in that environment, to preserve traditional order, um, really cracking down on crime has become one way to express the idea we don't like the direction of social change and we want to do something aggressive to prevent further change from further eroding our situation. Next slide, please. This then gets us at the rate of violence in the United States. The diagram on the left is a calendar, right? I hope you can see that. And you should be looking for white boxes. Those are days on which the police did not kill a single individual in the United States. And as you can see, they're few and far between. The first day in 2022, when the police did not kill someone, was January 3rd. The second day was April 17th, right? And so you got to wait a couple months in between to get a day where the police don't kill someone. The red boxes are days when the police kill 3 or more people, and obviously they prevail in this way of looking at police violence. The diagrams on the right show two different comparisons. Which countries in the world have the highest number of police killings? And you can see the Philippines, Brazil, Venezuela, India, Syria, El Salvador, and then the United States. You might be perplexed. What list is it that has those countries in the United States on it? What do they have in common? Well, almost every other country on this list is a country that is quite lawless, that has in many respects a failed state, or has very high levels of state repression and violence against their own people, especially their dissidents, and use the police for that purpose. And then there's the United States, right? And so if we reorganize this and put us on a list of the countries we're most comparable with in terms of our racial demographics, our rates of crime, the availability of guns, our economies, we come up with the list on the right at the bottom: Canada, Australia, the Netherlands. And as you can see, we have 3 to 15 times the rate of crime of the countries that we are most comparable with. And again, we can then drill down. Why is it that Canada or Australia, society is very similar to us, including in Australia having very lax gun regulations? Why is it that these societies have such a reduced rate of police killings per year? And the issue is simple. They don't send men with arms to apprehend motorists who have a taillight that isn't working. They don't send men with guns when there's a domestic dispute or a person suffering from a mental health crisis, right? They send psychologists, social workers, or police, but not armed police. They reserve their armed police for interdicting violent crime, right? And in the United States, we don't have that policy, and we do have this much higher rate of gun violence. Next slide, please. Um, Next thing to see, and this is just to really underline that point and give you some more details on it. In the United States, right, only a little bit less than a third of the people killed by the police are killed during an alleged violent crime. What that means is that two-thirds of the people who are killed by the police are not engaged in an alleged violent crime at the time they're killed by the police. Traffic violations, mental health and welfare checks, other non-violent offenses, domestic disturbances, that counts right there for more than 50% of police killings. Then there's another thing to notice, that roughly 30% of African Americans who are killed by the police flee from the police, right? And you can see Pacific Islanders, Native Americans, Hispanics flee at or I should say, are killed while fleeing at a rather similar rate. It's lower for whites and Asians. And again, I just thinking about what my students say to me when they watch the Tyre Nichols footage. What should we do in this situation? Do we just have to stay there and take it, even if it's potentially going to do grave damage to us? Or do we naturally go into a fight or flight mode and try to escape the violence? Next slide, please, John. Um, Again, this is stuff we've talked about together before. There are reforms that work, that we know have worked, have succeeded. And the question here is not, and this is worth emphasizing, changing police ideas about race, right? I mean, we do need to do that work. And one of the good things about community-based policing is that once the police get into the neighborhood and start speaking with the residents in the neighborhood, they recognize that most of the residents don't fit their stereotypes. And as we know from a whole bunch of work, going back to Gordon Allport's really important work on prejudice 50 plus years ago in social psychology, contact is the best way to remove the power of a stereotype. But having said that, the techniques that have been proven to be most effective are really simple techniques. They can be taught in a day or at most a week, and they just require the police to adopt certain policies and then adhere to those policies, right? Use all other means before shooting. Yeah, use the use of force always has to be reported. Ban chokeholds and strangleholds. And the one that I think is really illuminating and perhaps kind of the key to all of these is required de-escalation. And so very quickly, when we know this, I'll just have to back up for a second. Jennifer Eberhardt at Stanford, a MacArthur Fellow, person who's done an awful lot to help us understand implicit bias, and who also works with police departments regularly. Among the projects she's been involved in is looking at transcripts, or generating transcripts, actually, looking at radio recordings of police traffic stops, right? And she has a database of tens of thousands of them, and coding them by race, and then by courtesy, respect, disrespect, and aggression. And what she finds is very clear, right? That in the average traffic stop where a police officer is pulling over a white person in a good neighborhood, the interaction is respectful, cordial, professional. And in the average traffic stop where a police officer is pulling over a black person in a inner city or less well-off neighborhood, the interaction starts with aggression and disrespect. And when somebody is treated in that way, again, I just feel like we have to recognize we're social primates. When somebody manifests aggression or disrespect to us, there are things that happen in our brains and bodies that make us much more likely to be frightened and aggressive in return. And this can be manifest in the tone of voice and what is said, in the way in which the face and the body are comported, whether the officer keeps his hand on his gun. De-escalation says recognize that you're likely to come on more aggressive in certain situations and less aggressive in other situations. When you come on aggressive, that the person that you manifest that orientation to is going to mirror it back to you, and it can very quickly escalate. You're the person with the gun, the uniform, the authority. You step back and you try to take a breath and you try to calm this down. And in a sense, although these other measures are more effective at reducing killings, I think de-escalation is the core of all of this. David raised his hand, so I'm going to pause for a second. I think we should stay in the slides, David. I won't be able to see your face, but just we have enough logistical problems today. Go ahead. If you
Okay, what strikes me is there's a difference between aggressive and assaultive. And I think of the police as more assaultive than, I mean, they're aggressive, but I think of them as more assaultive. Could you comment on that?
Sure. And so I guess I'm going to be literal in the way I interpret assaultive, and you can correct me if that's not the way you intend it. What happened with Tyre Nichols is assaultive, right? That means you lay hands on, you punch, you kick, you spray, you tase, you hit with a baton, often you shoot. And the clear thing we want to do is prevent that from happening as much as possible, except in those cases where there is no alternative but to use lethal violence, either for the police to actually save their own lives or to save the lives of other people around them, right? And there are those cases, and those are so-called good or clean killings. We would like there not to be, but I think we have to recognize, as long as we have as many guns as we do in our society, as long as our culture is as violent as it is, there's going to be cases like that. But having said that, the case that concerns me here is the case that is preventable, right? And what we saw before, this is happening in traffic stops, in responding to domestic disputes, in people who are having mental crises, people who are unarmed and no threat to the police officer end up being killed or beaten by the police. And this happens at points because the police are thuggish, right? And I think we have to be honest about that. And those police officers probably need to be off the force, right? And the police need to be better at policing themselves so that they don't recruit and retain people like that. But even when that is done, we have a broader culture in which there is fear, mistrust, an association of African Americans and criminality and violence. And so even good apples, even police officers who, like Tyre Nichols, maybe want to go into the police force to do things to make the police better, may end up manifesting the prejudice that all of us have internalized as simply a ubiquitous, inescapable aspect of our society, its media, our culture. And those people, I don't want to say they're assaultive per se, but they are aggressive because their implicit bias leads them to be aggressive. And they need these techniques to keep them from doing things that they're going to regret, that may haunt them later. Does that help, David? I can't hear you now. I don't know if you're muted or not. Okay.
Yes, it does. It does help. I guess I still see assaultive as coming after, and I certainly believe that cops are coming after, and there's so many jokes. And the aggressive part for me is the escalation of that. Maybe aggression is the escalation of assaultive. I don't know.
Yeah,
Thank you.
and so I see it the exact opposite from that, but I think you and I are talking in the same way, even if our vocabulary is a little bit different. And I do think that there's a separate problem here, which is if you're talking about the way the police intervene in, and then, segregated, hyper segregated, high concentration of intergenerational poverty, high Black, high crime neighborhoods. The vocabulary here is ghetto, right? That they view as a war zone, right? They joke about getting war pay for working there, and so the attitude there is different. Um, and maybe that's what you're describing. But I think I do want to move on, if that's okay, because I've got a fair bit more information to cover. We did start late. Let's see what we got next. I can't see my own slides, right? And so this is just the evidence that reform works, right? And so Buffalo and Orlando, similar demographics, similar overall size of the city, similar crime rates, and yet Buffalo instituted many of these reforms, and over a 3+ year period had no police killings. Orlando didn't, and over that same period had 13. The diagram on the left shows you a little bit more evidence that these reforms work, not just anecdotally one place versus the other, but systematically. Next slide, please. And very quickly, in terms of the media's capacity to shape our attitude, I think one of the questions is, well, these reforms work. We recognize we have a problem. Why don't we do these reforms across the board? And this diagram, which I've shared with many of you before in the context of an earlier lecture, it shows what happened in the immediate aftermath of the George Floyd killing. And on the left, you can see for a brief period in late May and early June of 2020, trust in Black Lives Matter ultimately exceeded trust in law enforcement, according to public opinion polls. I don't think, by the way, that's a trade-off. I think you can, in a sense, trust both, but at least you should trust the people who are saying we have a problem with police violence against Black men and Black people. The diagram on the right shows that there's a brief period in May and June of 2020 when white support for Black Lives Matters exceeds white opposition to it. Very quickly, the opposition snaps back to actually higher levels than we had prior to the George Floyd killing. Next slide, please. And I think the explanation of why that happened is a little bit more complex than this diagram captures, but I think a very important feature of it is news coverage. And Fox News is the most widely watched cable news network in the country. And as you can see, in covering protests when it came to Black Lives Matters, CNN, Fox, MSNBC all basically had the same frequency of that kind of coverage in those terms. But when it came to covering looting and rioting, Fox used those terms, used those frames to indicate to their watchers what the significance of the Black Lives Matter protests were, what their primary purpose was, twice or 4 times as often as CNN, MSNBC. Next slide, please. So we're in a political climate where it's hard to bring about reform because major networks, major parties, major forces in our society want us to think that these reforms are being lobbied for by people who are lawless, rioters, and not law-abiding protesters. And so we can see there were some important reforms, but not nearly enough. Next slide, please. We can also see that, back when geographically those reforms were concentrated in blue states and mainly absent in red states. Next slide, please. And again, I apologize. I think I have more. Yeah, next slide. I had edited these slides, but that must not be what I actually sent to John. And this is just, I want to frame this as an issue of social priorities, right? In the state of California, over a 20-year period, the increase in the budget for higher education was 5%. The increase in the budget for incarceration was 90%, right? And so the forces preventing reform are really distorting our social priorities as a whole. Next slide, please. The next feature to think about the broader social context here is to think about segregation in the United States. This is from Ryan Enos's very important book, The Space Between Us. It shows both highly segregated and hyper segregated in the United States. Highly segregated here is where a neighborhood is between 30 and 60% Black. Remember that African Americans constitute 14% of the population roughly, and so, represented at double or quadruple their population in the population as a whole in these neighborhoods. And then hyper segregated are between 61 and 100% Black. Those are the Black patches on this quiltwork map. Next slide, please. This shows us Chicago. And it's kind of the textbook case for segregation in the United States. What you see, right, is plenty of areas that are 85% or more Black and plenty of areas that are 90% or more white. And that these coincide with natural barriers, the public transportation and highway system used to create barriers between neighborhoods. And we know that this was deliberately, intentionally, legally institutionalized, a segregation plan by the Chicago City Council in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, when the Great Migration sent millions of African Americans from the South into cities like Chicago. Next slide, please. Again, I think the order is going to be a little bit off. I had tried to do something different, but the idea that when you are Black in the United States, the likelihood that you're going to live in a neighborhood that has a high concentration of poverty is much higher. And so the two center bars there show that for whites who live in cities, there's a little bit more than a 1 in 10 chance that they'll live in a neighborhood of highly concentrated poverty. For whites in the suburbs, it's only 3%. African Americans, it's 3 times that rate. So more than a third of African Americans who live in cities live in areas of highly concentrated intergenerational poverty. This matters in this context because where are the police going when they go to, quote, high crime neighborhoods, right? They're going to largely Black neighborhoods all too often, neighborhoods that have been constructed, engineered, deliberately produced by law and policy, and then reinforced by the banks and the real estate industry. This is not just a voluntary pattern of affiliation. Next slide, please. And if we go, okay, there we go, right? And very quickly, this is just to show you, right, that the rate in which Blacks live in concentrated urban poverty is much higher in every city in the United States. Next slide. That if we look at the geography of this, and I'll be quick, this is New York, the areas in white, so you can see it in the upper east and west side of Manhattan. You can see it in the far east of Brooklyn, for instance. Those are areas that are mostly white and very high income. And then the areas that are darker, those are areas that are more highly concentrated people of color and highly concentrated poverty. New York is not as bad as most American cities. Next slide, please. We know how this was produced, right? This is a map of redlining in the United States. The federal government, yeah, often assisted by or working with insurers and banks, drew lines on maps. Very often, the lines simply reflected the racial demographics of the neighborhoods and basically said, we will provide GI support for home ownership, will provide federal federally backed mortgages, federal mortgage insurance to areas that we deem safe. What are those areas? Well, those are the green areas. Those are the areas with high concentrations of white people or low concentrations of black people. And on the other hand, we will not provide any of that assistance. And so this reinforced segregation and reinforced the class divide, really producing the white middle class and excluding African Americans from gaining access to it. Next slide, please. And as you might note from those maps, I think you're familiar with those areas, many of you, they remain, that those maps are from the 1930s, the essentially racial map of Oakland and San Francisco today. Washington, D.C. is a little bit more typical of American cities, and it's a nice grid system. So you can see the northwest of Washington, D.C. is the lightest color on the map. It is mostly white, mostly high income. The southeast, the bottom of that diamond, is mostly non-white and mostly low income. Where do you think the police are going? And when the police pull you over in the Northwest, what do you think the transcript of that interaction is going to be? When they pull you over in the Southeast, you're going to have a very different, much less respectful, much more aggressive and hostile interaction with the police, depending on which area of the city you're in. Next slide, please. I want to go into some of the social science here for just a moment. I'm not going to speak anymore about Ryan Enos. I just wanted you to see the cover of the book that the data on segregation was coming from. He's a professor of political science and runs a really interesting political psychology lab at Harvard University. I do want to speak a little bit more about Jennifer Eberhardt, who's one of the leading social scientists, social psychologists in the United States today, and then Claude Steele, who is the provost of UC Berkeley and author of this book, Whistling Vivaldi, about how stereotypes get into us, under our skin, we internalize them, and then all our efforts at goodwill are not capable of counteracting the hold they have on us. Yeah, next slide, please. And I'm going to go very quickly through this material. I just want to point out, and this will be stuff we'll come back to when we get back into the lifespan revolution, that our brains are category generating machines. They're just designed to sort the world. And that includes the social world, the human world. And what we see from these works in social psychology is that human children at a very young age learn to recognize faces, and that this is essential to their survival, that they be able to recognize their mother and their father's face, and to know who is kin or friend, caregiver, and that it turns out we have a whole circuitry, a whole region of the brain, or set of regions that are linked in an interconnected network that allow us to do facial recognition very efficiently, unconsciously, quickly, easily, so-called system one process, and that's actually very hard to do. It also turns out that there seems to be a fork in that system, where if someone is the same race as you, you then activate the facial recognition system, and your brain automatically, unconsciously, implicitly, unreflectively starts paying attention to all the details: the size of the nose, the size of the forehead, the color of the eyes and the hair, the shape of the mouth, so that the next time you see them, you can recognize them. But if the person is of a different race, it takes a different fork, and that whole system is not activated. And so the point of this is that it is actually for most of us. We have to really either be in a peculiar circumstance, adopted, for instance, by people who are a different race than we are, or someone who regularly puts themselves into a context where there are many people of another race present, a white person teaching in an African American school, or vice versa, and we get better at recognizing the other race. But the takeaway from this is that our brains do things automatically, unconsciously, implicitly, that we are unaware of, that lead us to treat people differently in our social world on the basis of the phenotype, the structure of their face. The brain is sensitive to this. And then the idea that the architecture of our brain is met halfway by the history and the disparities of our society. The brain is also very attuned to social geography. Which space is my space? Which space isn't my space? Who lives in, what kind of people live in the space that is the space I belong in? What kind of people live in the space that I don't belong in? And the fact that by law and policy and economics, we have segregated our society so cleanly, so neatly, also contributes to this. And then the stuff we see in the media on a constant basis from a very young age further reinforces this. And this then leads to this incredibly robust finding. You put almost any American in a lab, a psychology lab, you expose them to images so fast that they can't see what, or you can't actually recognize what you've seen, but the image registers unconsciously. You expose them to white faces and Asian faces, and the response is neutral. You expose them to African American men's faces, especially ages 16 to 46, and almost everyone has a fear response. We see it in the brain, we see it in the body's chemistry, we see it in the heart rate, the flush of the face, the elevation of the blood pressure. It's a fight or flight response, and it is because our society has so thoroughly inculcated in us an association of black male and crime. So let us be clear about this. This is not just a police problem. This is a problem with American culture. And ultimately, fixing this is not just going to involve reforming the police, it's going to have to involve the much more difficult project of cultural reform, of changing the way we represent ourselves and each other in our media. Just to get back to the police for a second, Eberhard has shown, I think it's really important, that if you're a police officer in an urban area in the United States today, on average, you hear 100 times in a day, crime in progress, black male, possibly armed, right? And that association, crime, black male, potentially armed, is so reinforced that it's very hard to resist it taking hold when you hear it that many times. Next slide, please, John. We're almost there, I promise. And this is just to preview. Oh, I'm sorry. This is about the media. One moment. And just to be as clear as possible, right? Again, the disparity between the media and the real life, right? And so what roles do African Americans get cast in TV and film, right? And as you can see, right, 2/3 of African Americans who are in our media environment are playing gang members, gangsters, thugs, gang bangers, that when in film, they're looking to portray a criminal. 2/3 of the time it's portrayed by a Black person. In our actual society, it's only 1/3 of the time that criminals are actually African American. And so and social media too. Next slide, please. I just want a moment to talk about ageism. And so this is Becca Levy. I'm going to tell you about her work in much greater detail in a future lecture. She's at Yale University. She's in the School of Public Health, where she's a professor of epidemiology, because she makes the argument that we have an epidemic of ageism in the United States, and that leads to a public health crisis. She's also a social psychologist and full professor of psychology at Yale. Next slide, please. And I'm not going to speak with you in any detail about this today, but she has this theory called stereotype embodiment theory. And the idea is, if you are a member of a stereotype group, that stereotype will get inside of you and make it very hard for you to resist self-stereotype, right? And that in particular, if the stereotype is negative, in situations where it's relevant, that will increase the stress on you, knowing that you think that people are viewing you in a negative light, or that you are viewing yourself. Let's talk for just a moment about the health consequences of this. Next slide. And this research I just think is so phenomenal. So the diagram on the left shows that when you take elderly people, people in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, and you expose them to positive age beliefs, and she does this for 10 minutes a week. After 5 weeks, no change in their regimen otherwise, no physical intervention. You're just trying to get them to believe positive things about aging. After 5 weeks, their physical functioning, measured by how well they walk, how well they balance, how strong their grip is, how well they breathe, things like that, right? 60% improvement. After 6 weeks, nearly 100% improvement. After 8 weeks, nearly a 200% improvement. Without going into the details, Levy demonstrates, I think, quite persuasively, that the internalization of a positive age belief system, replacing a negative age stereotype, changes the way in which people don't not only think of themselves and behave, but their actual physical well-being. The diagram on the right shows people who have the genetic predisposition to Alzheimer's and compares them with the general population. And as you can see, people with the genetic predisposition have a higher rate of Alzheimer's than the overall population. But people with the genetic predisposition who have positive age beliefs actually have a substantially lower rate of Alzheimer's than people who do not have the genetic predisposition to it. And actually, the people with the positive beliefs are very close to the people in the general population who have positive beliefs as well, in terms of their incidence of Alzheimer's. And what Levy demonstrates, simple way of describing this, is that about 3/4 of health-related issues to do with aging stem not from biological or genetic factors, but from psychological and stereotype factors. And to just emphasize for a moment the bottom line, we all potentially suffer from stereotyping related to aging. One way to put this is prejudice against our future selves, and it takes hold of us before we are ourselves elderly, and therefore can be very hard to shake, right? But the fact that our society is getting older, John, we can actually get out of the slides now. This is the last slide I want to share today. The fact that our society as a whole is getting older, the fact that I think we are beginning to become more conscious about ageism, may just be an opportunity not only to address ageism, right, which is going to affect people, white, black, brown, Asian, everyone, right, but also to begin thinking about how to address other forms of stereotype and prejudice as well. We have a terrible historical and current problem with racism in our society. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we were able to use the fight against ageism as a toehold to begin the harder, longer work of also working against racism? Bob, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead.
The point that you made about the representation of blacks in particular in various media and whatnot, I have detected a significant change in commercials on television, the number of black people that are portrayed as good people, as average people or whatever. And I wonder how long that's going to, how that can affect everybody's understanding of this. And I think it's going to take some time, but the direction is in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think that's right, and I think that's important. I think if the commercial has a positive representation in what you're actually watching, whether it's the news or a movie or crime drama, has a negative representation, then it's going to have less effect. I'll also point out one more thing that Eberhardt and others have documented, which is you take positive representations of African Americans in the media. And you then, this is in situations where they're interacting with others. You edit them out, right? You put them off screen. You mute the video, and you have people just watch the faces of the actors they're interacting with. And then you ask them to evaluate what's happening. And they think something bad is happening, right? That there's something scary or threatening happening. It turns out, it's I don't know if you've seen these new commercials, Television Dad, right? This might be one of the examples. I think it's Allstate, right? It's some insurance company, and Television Dad is a black man who is the perfect, kind, older man. And all that to say, children, especially young children, pick up on facial cues and body language often more than they do on explicit verbal content, right? And the racism in our society is such that you can be saying one thing and your face and your body language may be revealing something else. And that may perpetuate the racism, even as the people making that commercial are doing their very best to present a positive image of American race relations, because they know all the people in urban environments who have a lot of money want that and will buy the good if they think it makes them a good liberal to do so. Iris, go ahead. You have to unmute yourself.
Okay, I'd like to pick up on what Bob said and ask you if you can find any data on how ads are selected for geographical areas. We've got a woke culture here on the West Coast. Are our ads showing positive images of Black interactions the same as what's being shown in Memphis or Orlando? I'd be very interested to know about the geographical dispersion of positive and what we might call traditional ads.
And so, Iris, I think that's a really interesting question and a good challenge for me. And I'll try to do a little bit of research on that. But let me start out with something I do know. And it's a little bit different, but it's probably similar, which is that we can get really good data from Google. Who's searching for what, right? And it's anonymous data, but it's regionally specific. They do a lot of what they call geolocating. And a fair bit of this focuses on, for instance, who's searching for racist jokes. And so we can see which areas in the country people are searching for racist jokes. And then we can see how Barack Obama, being the presidential candidate, influences support for Democrats in those areas. And it drives the support for Obama down 3, 4, 5%, just, relative to the previous white Democrat, right? And so your hunch, I think, about geography is exactly right and borne out in that kind of research. And then the other thing to recognize is that, at least for people of a certain age, the primary way they get their media now is over their devices, right? Not over their television stations.
Right.
Television is still broadcast, right? Goes to everybody. The stuff that we get in our social media is narrowcast, specifically tailored to our browsing history. And so my guess is the place you would really find this, but the place that it's really hard to get the data on, is actually social media and viewing the news on your phone or your computer instead of with your television. All right, we went really late. I know we've got to get to lunch. Flossie, go ahead. Why don't I give you the last question for today? Go ahead. You're still muted, Flossie.
Again.
There you
Now,
go.
I have a friend. He's a black man, very handsome black man. He's a social worker. And he works in Oakland. He may be retired now, for all I know. His method when he had to be in the streets at night was to say hello to everybody. If he passed a little old white lady, it would be good evening. When he passed a policeman and he said, "Good evening, brother," the cop might not know what to do and became slightly aggressive. Maybe this guy was a smartass. He still does it. It seems to work. But if the police were trained to say good evening to everybody when they walk the streets, that might make a hell of a difference.
If we
They
could get
walk.
rid of the cars.
They're not gods, they're gentlemen. And
Yeah.
if they say good evening, madam, good evening, sir, or even good evening, brother, that would be a wonderful way to go. I just thought I'd share that with you.
Thank you, Flossie. And that puts me in mind of two things. And so many of you know I've lived in England for a few years. And in England, a police officer is a bobby, right? And doesn't carry a gun and is exactly the kind of person you'd say hello to and the kind of person you'd expect to say hello to you, right? It's a different police culture. It's a different overall civic culture to the society in terms of the image, the generalized image of what is it like to interact with a police officer. So yes, and in our culture and part of what people who are analyzing what happened in Memphis suggest is that the police need to appear fearsome, they think, in order to garner the respect of the thugs in the neighborhoods they're policing, right? The second thing you put me in mind of is Claude Steele's Whistling Vivaldi, and this idea that his friend and classmate in graduate school in Hyde Park, Chicago, who was a big dark-skinned black man, would walk down the street at night whistling Vivaldi in the same way you're describing, to kind of say, I'm not threatening, to try to put other people at ease because it made him feel bad to recognize that other people feared him, right? And so that goes back to the self-stereotyping. If everybody around you is looking at you like, "Ooh, maybe I should cross the street," it gets inside of you and it's not good for you. All right, everybody. Good conversation. Sorry about the logistical obstacles. We'll try to get that sorted out for next week. Look forward to seeing everybody next Saturday. Take care, all. Bye-bye.
David.
Yes. Yeah, go ahead,
One
Wendy.
last one.
Oh,
I
no,
want-
who is that? Iris, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to thank you for mentioning El Irian's book, The Only Game in Town. It's a fabulous, readable, accessible explanation of central banks and how they influence our economy. So I wanted to thank you for that recommendation.
I am so happy to hear that you're reading it and that you're liking it. You just made my day. Thank you, Iris.
Good day.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.